introduce our speaker for today. Mr. Lance King joins us from New Zealand and is the founder of The Art of Learning, an organization that provides courses for parents, students, and teachers, aiding them to improve their learning processes. He's the author of a blog, as well as the author of many books relating to pedagogy, such as his latest book, The Importance of Failing Well. Let us welcome him to the stage, Mr. Lance King.
Thank you, Dhruv. Very nice. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here. I'll just get myself organised. This is my first time to this school. I've been to Singapore to one or two other schools in the past, but this is my very first time here. So yesterday I was working all day with all the staff, and today I worked with one group of students. And it's been very enjoyable 2 days. Tomorrow I head back home, but I do come through Singapore quite often. Now this is my website if you're interested. Do you all have a copy of this page here? You all have one of these? Okay. So it's got the website address at the top and also at the back. If you're interested in any of the slides I'm showing you today, the slides are all available on my website. You go to the articles section and look for slides for the Parents Seminar. And you can always send me any questions to my email address, which is on the back of this. Excuse me, I'm just about to cough. The worst thing about wearing a headset is you can't cough. Okay, so I come from New Zealand, as a principal does, up here at the top of the world. And I spend my life traveling around the world. About 21 years ago, I designed my very first learning improvement program for students. And I've been delivering that program and many others around the world in 25 different countries for the last 21 years. But of course, these days I do a lot more work with teachers and a lot more work with parents. But the interesting thing about working in so many different countries with so many different students, nearly 200,000 students now, is that I discover that students are all the same. They all have the same issues. They all have the same problems. They have problems getting work done on time. They have problems with motivation. They have problems with stress, with pressure, with expectations from other people. They have all the same, very similar problems. And that's always an interesting thing to discover, that students are essentially all the same. Where I come from is a small town on the west coast of the North Island of New Zealand called Raglan, which is famous for one thing, and it's not me, it's famous for surfing. And it has a very unusual surf because the waves in Raglan go the wrong way. Most waves in the world break from the right side to the left side. In Raglan, they break from the left side to the right side. So they go backwards. But more importantly, it's where my children grew up. I have 4 children. I have a son who is 32, and a son who is 30, and a son who is 25, and a daughter who is 27. And I'll talk a little more about them a bit later, but 2 of my children did very well at school, went straight through and got good qualifications, went straight to university, got good degrees, went straight out into work. And 2 of my children did not. 2 of my children failed at school, dropped out of school. One of them dropped out in what you would call year 6, and one of them dropped out in what you'd call year 5. And that was an interesting journey for myself and my wife. But it all turned out well in the end. My 2 children who dropped out eventually went back to school and eventually went to university and did very well, but I'll come to that later. These are the courses that I deliver in schools for students. So I have 4 different student courses for students of different age groups. And the one I was doing today for students who were finding some of the diploma work to be difficult for them, problems of motivation and problems of stress, I was doing this course here called Courage, Resilience and Failing Well. But I do courses for all different year groups. My specialty area is the skills of effective learning, how to learn effectively and how to learn efficiently. And I've done a lot of writing in this area. If you want to read anything that I've written, you can Google me, but if you Google Lance King, you'll get this guy here. And this is not me on a bad day. This is apparently some famous heavy metal star. But it's got the same name as me. So to get my work, you have to put the G in, Lance G. King, and you'll get work that I've written, okay? And this is my website. You're welcome to go there. There is a tab called Tips for Parents. So there's a lot of information for parents on my website if you are interested. Okay? Now, I guess in talking to parents, I like to start with the biggest questions first. So the biggest question, that's a very important question for education all around the world today, is simply, what is the ultimate purpose of school-based education? Because once upon a time, the ultimate purpose of school was very, very easy to predict. The world was easy to predict. Nowadays, of course, the only thing you can predict about the future is that you can't predict the future. That change is happening faster than it's ever happened before, and there's all sorts of things happening around the world right now that we would never have predicted would happen. So the real challenge is, what is the purpose? What are we sending our children to school for? What do we want schools to do for our children? And as a parent, that's a very important question for me. So when I ask parents, other parents, the question, I get a lot of answers. I get some parents who are very focused on the schools helping their children to pass exams. Now, of course, I imagine you wouldn't say that was the ultimate purpose, but of course you do want your children to pass their exams, I imagine. But it's not the ultimate purpose, is it? So maybe you think you want your children to gain good qualifications. I think good qualifications are very useful things to have. And in my experience, having worked in most of the educational systems around the world, or in many of them, I think that the IB diploma is certainly the best qualification you can get in secondary schools in any country in the world. So I do think it's a very good qualification, so that's worth having. I guess you want your children to get into a good university, and the more educated they have, the better their qualifications, the more likely it is that they will get into the university of their choice. I guess you also want your school to prepare your children well for 21st century careers. And of course, 21st century careers are quite different from careers up to now, aren't they? I mean, I had a very good example of this in my family just last year when my daughter, who has a master's degree, she went through university, got a master's degree, and she got her first job. And her very first job was as the social media marketing manager for a shared equity app development company. What does that mean? I mean, it's a very interesting thing. You know, apps are very new. 5 years ago, there weren't any apps. 5 years ago, there wasn't much social media. And now she has a job in that area as a social media marketing manager. Now, that's something that could not have existed 5 years ago. And that's a very interesting thing. So how do we prepare children for jobs that didn't ever exist? It's a big question. I guess you probably want school to help your children learn how to make a positive difference in the world, how to make a positive impact, how to make their life meaningful. But you see, all these things are all kind of part of the same thing, it seems to me. And it seems to me that there is one thing which could be the purpose of schooling, which would actually help children to achieve all those things. And it seems to me the modern purpose of education, the reason children are at school these days, is to learn how to cope with a changing world. And the particular skills they need to cope with a changing world are the skills of learning. Now, if the purpose of schooling is to help children develop into brilliant learners, people who can learn from any person, in any place, at any time, using any media, then it doesn't matter what the world is like, does it? Because wherever they find themselves, whatever position they find themselves in, if they're a great learner, then they will be able to take advantage of that. Does that make sense? So I see the purpose of modern education as helping children to become brilliant in learning itself, to learn the skills of effective learning. But this is not a new quest. I mean, it's been around forever. I've been in education for over 30 years, and I've seen all these movements go through education. How to help children become self-managed and self-regulated and self-independent and autonomous, and of course, successful lifelong learners. You've all seen those words before, lifelong learners? It's a common word, isn't it? It's a common concept. But what does it really mean? I mean, I think it would be impossible for anyone not to be a lifelong learner, wouldn't it? How would you survive? You know, how would you learn how to use your new phone? How could you use the microwave that you just bought if you weren't a lifelong learner? It's actually an interesting time in the world, because if you did get a new phone, or maybe even a new microwave, would you start using it straight away? Or would you give it to someone else in your household and say, here, can you have a look at this and see how this works and then teach me later? I think for the first time ever, we're actually using our children to teach us how to use technology. Does that happen in your household? Something new, you give it to the youngest member of the household to work out how to use it and then tell you about it. Well, that's what we do in my household anyway. So we've got to think, okay, if we want children to be brilliant learners, what are the characteristics of 21st century learners? What are the characteristics we're looking for? So just think about, how do you want your child to be by the time they finish at school? Do you want them to be able to focus and concentrate? Would that be good? Would that be a useful skill? Do you want them to be good time managers, to be well organized, to be able to manage their own time, not need someone else to do it? Do you want them to be self-motivated and hardworking and persevering, to stick at things? Great. Do you want them to be independent and accurate researchers? In other words, how to find the material they need and how to check that it's valid information? Do you want them to have good information processing skills? You know, most jobs in the world today are dealing with an overload of information, how to process that effectively and reach the result that's desired. Do you want them to be creative and innovative thinkers? You know, it's often said that creativity is the most essential skill these days, and yet in very few schools do I see a program actively teaching children to be creative. In this school, there is a program on innovation and creativity, and I think that's a very important strand to education, is teaching children how to be creative, how to generate ideas that don't yet exist. Do you want them to be responsible for their own actions, self-evaluating and reflective, and self-correcting? Would you like all those things? Would you like this magic individual to turn up at home one day? Is that what you want? So if that's the case, if you'd like this person to turn up one day, I guess the question is, what do you and myself as a parent, what can we do to help this? So if you'd like to see this person turn up, do you ever do any of these things? Do you ever do any of these things? Do you do all of these things? Of course, at some age, you need to do all these things, don't you? When children are little, you've got to do all these things for them. But the point I'm trying to make with this is simply that the more you do for your children, the less they learn to do for themselves. And it's the children that need to learn how to do all these things for themselves, isn't it? I mean, it's absolutely critical. I don't know if you've heard of that book, The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. It was a book that was written for an audience in this part of the world, I think. Now, I don't know what you think about that book, but I think there is a misconception in that book. See, I don't think the Tiger Mother is a particularly good model, because in that model, it is the mother who's doing all the work. It's the mother who's organizing all the time. It's the mother who's providing all the motivation. It's the mother who's providing all the drive. It's the mother who's doing all the work. And the child just becomes that passive recipient of all that effort provided by someone else. So who's learning the skills? It's not the child that's learning to manage their own time and motivate themselves and produce drive and desire and passion and all those things they need. It is someone else. So I don't think it's a very good model, because it actually produces more passive children. The last thing we want is our children to be passive. You can't be passive and successful in the 21st century. You've got to be an active learner. So I'm not a great fan of the Tiger Mother as a model. So this is an interesting thing. So you've got to think about, at what stage do you need to start giving your child more responsibility? At what time do you need to allow them to make mistakes and learn from their own mistakes? At what time do you stop saving them from problems and difficulties? So, I mean, it's all about learning, it seems to me. Now, the key thing about learning is, well, I see learning as a model that has three parts to it, and I'm going to deal with those three parts separately. I see the model as being efficacy, agency, and action. Now, I'm using those words in a particular way. By efficacy, I mean self-belief. It seems to me that children must first believe that success in learning is possible for them in order for them to be successful. Secondly, they've got to learn the skills, strategies, and techniques of effective learning. And there's no question anymore, there are definitely skills that the best students in school have that every student could learn and improve their performance. And thirdly, they must be prepared to take action, make mistakes, and fail well. So I'll talk about these in turn. Firstly, the efficacy part. Now, efficacy is interesting because I think that it starts with role models. You know, if you want your children to build a belief, a self-belief that they can learn and succeed through learning, then we have to provide role models of people who create success for themselves through learning. And those are not the people who generally turn up on the news or turn up on the television set. You know, all we're seeing on the news these days is disaster and mayhem and death and the whole horrors in the world brought right into your living room. But where are the role models of people who have turned their own life into a success through learning every day, through learning from their mistakes? And I don't think it's good enough to point to role models of people from other countries or role models from people from history. Those are useful, but I think children need role models of people who are just like them, people from their own community, people from around them to look at and think, wow, it's possible that I could be successful in this way. And of course, in Singapore, you have thousands and thousands of self-made success stories. I've picked up a few on the way here. I don't know if you know these, I don't know these people, so I've got written down their names. This woman, Chong Fit Lian, is the CEO of Jetstar. There is Olivia Lum, who is the president of HiFlux. There is a man named Neo Kat Kiat, who is the CEO of Neo Catering. There's a man named Patrick Liu, who is the head of HSR International. A woman named Annie Gan, Jiang Huang Construction. And the sixth one I picked was Michael Tiem of Atlas Sound and Vision. Now the thing that these 6 people have in common, I just picked them off the internet, but the thing they have in common is they are all Singaporean and they are all people who went from nothing to great success. Now, the only way you go from nothing to great success is by a combination of extremely hard work and learning from every mistake. So the role models are there all around us, all the time. And so I think it's very important to find those role models and talk about them to your children. Role models that show children that success comes out of hard work and making mistakes and learning from each one. And of course, your own stories are important too. You know, you need to tell your children your own stories, but they shouldn't just be the stories of all the successes you've had and the good things you've done. They should also be the stories of all the dumb and stupid things you've done in your life and what you learnt from each one of those, because those are real stories, and they can show children that it's possible to succeed even when you have some failure. These are very important lessons. So role models. And the second thing is self-confidence. I think we want our children to be confident in their ability to learn, self-confident. Now, I don't think we develop self-confidence through competition. There's nothing wrong with competition. It's good to see someone ahead of you and work really hard to catch up and beat them at something. But it doesn't produce self-confidence, because you can always find someone better than you and someone worse than you at anything. The only way we develop self-confidence, if you think about it, is by comparing ourselves with ourselves and noticing that we've moved ahead. Do you notice that? Now, I don't know if it's a tradition here in Singapore, but certainly in New Zealand, in many, many households, we have this unusual thing. I don't know if you have it here, but often in a New Zealand household, there'll be a pillar or a doorway or a post somewhere that's got little scratch marks on it and someone's name next to them. And they'll go up the post like this. And they're marks that show a child that they're growing. Do you do the same thing? Anything like that? Some people, I see a few nods. But you know, we seem to do it in my country. But the interesting thing is, we only do this visual thing, we only do this for growing up. We don't do it for anything else. And it's an interesting question to ask, why do we do that? And why do we do it just for growing? Now, I think the reason is because growing up happens so slowly that children don't notice they're growing up. In fact, they usually think that they're missing out. They think that everyone else, all their friends are growing up and they're not. So we put the little scratch marks on the post and the little dates to show them, it's all right, dear, look, you've grown an inch since last year, you're growing up too, it's happening for you. So then the child feels more confident, you see? They're confident because they've compared themselves with themselves and noticed that they're improving. Now, imagine if you took all the information that comes home from school about your child's progress and made it visual, made it in a chart, a graph, a picture, something like the scratches on the post, so a child could see that they have improved, that they have advanced, that they've moved ahead from last year. You see, it doesn't do any good for them to be compared with someone else. Comparing children with other children achieves nothing. It doesn't make them feel any better about themselves at all. Showing them that they have improved on where they were last year builds confidence. You know, one of the most useful things, I often get asked questions about mathematics. A lot of children find maths to be really difficult. Now you've got to think, what is a child's consistent experience of mathematics at school? Well, I think their consistent experience is just that it's hard. It's always hard. It was hard last year, it's hard this year, and I'm sure it's going to be hard next year. It's always hard. They don't actually notice that they've improved. They just consider it's all just hard. One of the most useful things you can do for children is to get them to look at last year's maths book. And they'll flick through last year's maths book and go, oh, I could do that in my sleep. That's so easy. And they'll notice that they've actually moved on. They've advanced. But if you don't show them that, they just think, well, it's hard. It's always hard. It's always going to be hard. And they don't get that feeling of confidence. So I think these are good lessons. You can help children to gain confidence in their own ability and skills by showing them information. The third thing is self-esteem. Now, self-esteem is an interesting thing in itself. It means it's a very difficult thing to come up with a definition of, but it means something to do with how valued we feel, right? Now, self-esteem, the reason I put this in here, because sometimes I see parents, I get to talk to parents sometimes, who only seem to ever value their children for their children's performance. In other words, what they do. Now think about that for a minute. So a child in that sort of household only gets any positive regard from their parents when they're getting the best marks and when they're behaving perfectly. Now see, if that's the only time a child gets positive regard from their parents, then what happens is that child's self-esteem is tied directly to their performance. And what that creates is a very fragile self-esteem. It's not strong, it's fragile. Because it can be destroyed like that. Because that day that that child doesn't get the best mark or doesn't perform perfectly, they suddenly feel like they have no value. They have no value in the household, so they have no self-esteem. You see, if a child's self-esteem was connected to the sort of person they are, into a belief that they are a good person, then that creates a very strong self-esteem. And when a child has a strong self-esteem, being valued for the wonderful human being they are, then that's a strong position to stand. And from that position, they can change their behavior easily. So a child who's grown up believing, having heard that they have all the qualities and the values of a good person, is very strong on the inside. And then if that child is performing badly or not achieving the grades or whatever, then a parent can say, look, you're a wonderful person, but your grades have got to improve, your performance has got to improve. And they can do that easily because they've got a strong place to stand. So I think it's very important to value your children first as human beings and second as human doings. And the last thing here is reaction to challenges, to build self-belief. You know, the consistent thing that's happening for your children every day at school is that teachers are challenging them to learn new things, right? You've got to learn this, you've got to learn this, got to learn. It's always new things. Now, how they react to those challenges is actually very important. Now, I don't know if any of you had any children on my course today. Did anyone have anyone on my course today? No, okay. But there was something that I did with children today that I'll demonstrate this point to you. You see, what I do with children, See this bag I've got here? What I do with children is I teach them how to do this. Now, the reason is simple, because it's a challenge. It's a challenge to learn something new. Now, you see I've got this whole bag full of juggling balls here. How about I take the next 15 minutes to teach all you how to juggle? How would that be? Do you notice what's happening inside your mind right now? You're having a little conversation with yourself, aren't you? And probably the first thing you're saying is he serious? And you're still not sure, are you? And then after that, you probably had a different conversation. Somebody in the audience might have said to themselves, that would be great, that would be wonderful. I've always wanted to learn how to do that. Someone else might be sitting there thinking, oh, might be all right, might be better than sitting here. And someone else might be sitting there thinking, impossible, that's crazy, I could never do that, I can't do that, the man must be mad. Now, you've got to realize that that conversation you're having with yourself is a reaction to being challenged to learn something new. You see? Now, this is what your children go through every single day in every single class, is the challenge to learn new things. And I think as parents, we can help them notice their reaction to challenging situations and help them learn to deal with that. Now, I'm not going to teach you how to juggle. That was just a bit of a setup. I'm sorry if you really wanted to, but maybe later. But the point was, you went through that experience. Now, what I try and do with children is I try and get them to notice the way they talk to themselves inside their head and set that up in a positive direction. So one way we can do that is by actually encouraging our children to take on challenges, to actually do things that they don't feel comfortable with, to push their own boundaries, and to notice their reaction. And what I do is I focus on language to begin with, and I focus on words like can't, I can't. And the problem with children saying I can't do my algebra, I can't do this, I can't do that, is that the words suggest that they never ever will. And that's like making a prediction of your future that's a negative prediction. So I encourage children to make a shift from I can't to I haven't yet. Or I haven't so far. Because when a child says I haven't yet instead of I can't, they're suggesting to themselves that maybe they will. And that opens up the possibility that they might succeed. And it's the first step in motivation. The very first step is facing that challenge, any challenge at all, saying, well, I haven't done it yet. That's true. Because it's just true. And I find children are very pragmatic. You can always get them to shift from I can't to I haven't yet. But I think parents sometimes make a mistake of trying to shift their children with everything from I can't to I can. But you see, when a child says I can do this before they've done it, they're trying to fool themselves. There's no advantage in fooling yourself. You've got to get it accurate. So encourage your children to turn every I can't into I haven't yet. And then they'll create the possibility of success. Does this make sense? So all those things create belief. Okay. So the second part of this was skills. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the data I've got on skills, but it is the biggest question that's being asked all around the world right now, is what are the most important skills for the 21st century? Now, these are papers that were published last year. This was just in 2015. There's a paper from Finland, one from Japan, one from Korea, one from the Netherlands, one from Austria, and one from Canada. These are all official government-level papers that are being written trying to work out what are the most important skills for the 21st century. Everyone's trying to do it. I'm a bit involved in the OECD group here, but there's a UNESCO group, the OECD, P21 is an American think tank, and there's the European Commission. They're all trying to work out what are the important skills for the 21st century. I'll just skim through this very quickly, but in this case, this is a research of corporate recruitment in the United States. What are the things that top corporate recruiters are looking for? Notice they're all skills, things like oral and written communication skills, critical thinking, problem solving, professionalism, collaboration, teamwork, IT, and leadership. Those were the top skills. And in this particular survey, knowledge of mathematics came 14th on the list, just ahead of science, knowledge, and foreign language comprehension. But it wasn't saying that these things were unimportant. It was saying that once you've got a good grounding of subject discipline, these are the skills that select out that person for the top job. The top jobs go to those who have those skills as well as good knowledge. Now that's a very important thing to realize. It's not enough just to know things. You've got to work out what to do with what you know, which is all skills. The 21st Century Project, which is running here in Singapore, I believe. This is a couple of years ago, but I think it's a 10-year project looking at the different skills important for the 21st century. If you look down there, they're the same skills again, all over the world. In the UK in 2008, they had a skills program put in place. All these slides are on my website if you're interested in them. In the USA, they have the Common Core State Standards that these days have a whole range of thinking skills in them. This is at the elementary school level. Canada, same thing again. And in the work I did, I've done a lot of work for the IB organisation, I found that all these countries have programs of learning skills in place. Everyone's doing it. The work I did for the IB was to take their learner profile that you might have seen, and it's turned into skill categories, and my work was turning that into these 10 skill clusters. If you're interested in that in great detail, there's a lot of work on my website on this. You're welcome to have a look at that. So here we have a framework of skills. So I can divide them up into separate areas. There is the general 21st century skill area, but then we can look inside that and look for the skills for school. There are some skills that definitely advantage children at school. Things like critical thinking, creative thinking, problem solving, memory, meaning and understanding, study skills, exam prep. There are lots of skills. Then there's a second area of skills, which is character building skills. Now, in the United States right now, there's a huge movement on developing character skills, things like self-motivation, perseverance, resilience, etc. And there's a fourth area of skills that I'd like to see in schools, and interestingly enough, you here have this program, which is entrepreneurial skills. Because I think all too often, children leave school thinking that their highest possible ambition is to work for someone else. I think it would be great if they left school thinking that their highest possible ambition could be to create employment, could be to generate their own business, and that requires entrepreneurial skills. But I just want to focus on these skills for school just for a minute, because I think there's some critical understandings that parents and children need to have. I've just pulled out a couple of little bits of data. Are you aware that at the high school level, 2/3 of students study for tests purely by rereading their notes or textbooks? Reading, rereading, 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 rote memorization. Not deep understanding, just rote memorization. And half of them do that reading the day before the test or the exam. They do it the day before because they think if I do it a week before, I'll probably forget it. So I can do it the night before just in the hope that I can remember it. And that 50% use passive repetition of key points as their single study strategy. All they do is go over things over and over and over and over and over and over again. That's terribly inefficient. And it takes a huge amount of time. You know, it's amazing how inefficient most students are. The research on memory and understanding shows that memory and understanding both come from taking concepts and ideas and turning them into your own words. You know, when your children can explain what they've learned at school to you in their own words, not the words of the teacher, not the words of the textbook, their own words, then you know they've created understanding. And when you understand something, that's the building blocks of memory. That creates the deepest memory, not rote memory, which is very shallow, deep memory, which is what we want. So when children are reading from a textbook, it's very important that they learn not just to read a chapter, then go back and read it again and read it again. What they've got to do is read a section, pause, reflect on what they've just read, maybe make a couple of notes, check that they've got it right, they've got the understanding, and then move on. If they read in small sections, they only need to read each chapter once. They don't need to read and reread. When they're making notes in class, Teachers put a lot of information up on the screen. It's no good to copy it down slavishly, every single thing that the teacher writes. What they've got to do is take the most important key points from what the teacher puts up and write their own sentences around that. Then they've created understanding. When they are summarising from textbooks, it's very important to do the same thing. Take the key points and create their own summary notes around them. It's completely obvious, isn't it? And yet children don't do this. They're convinced that if they memorise by rote, that will actually help. In fact, it produces very shallow memory. It doesn't last long. This is also the problem with extra subject tuition. I know extra subject tuition is a big thing here in Singapore. Also, I see it in Hong Kong, I see it in Korea, I see it in China. That after school and before school and weekend school and holiday school, all these things are thought to actually improve performance. And the unfortunate thing is they do a little, but it's usually very inefficient. Because what's been found is that single subject cramming and coaching does produce good immediate results. Like if you've got a test next week and you cram all week, then that will probably produce a better result next week. But a month later, it'll be gone again. And that's very unfortunate. I guess it's quite a good business model because you get the kids coming back because they forgot what you taught them last month. So in terms of business, it might be a great model. But in terms of efficient learning, it's not a good model. In fact, learning how to learn effectively and efficiently produces much better, more stable long-term results. And this is what some of these coaching schools should specialise in, not teaching maths and teaching science and teaching English. They should teach the skills of effective learning. Then children can do it for themselves. But then, once again, probably not a very good business model, is it? Because they'll go off and do it for themselves. But, you know, it produces a much better result for children. Okay. So those are the two things. That was the first thing, efficacy, and the second thing was action, skills. The third thing is this one here, which includes that word that you might find a bit unusual, is that word failing well. Now what this comes from a study that I did in 2007 to 2009 in New Zealand. And in this study, I was studying students at one high school in New Zealand. And I had 100 students to study, and they ranged in ages from 13 years old to 18 years old. So here, I guess that would be year 2 to year 6, maybe. And I had 100 students, and they were the high ability students at the school. And I was trying to find any connection to their academic success, what made for success. And halfway through my study, they all had a major external exam. Now, some of these students passed that exam at the very top level, did brilliantly. And some of them did reasonably well, given their ability level, and some did very badly, very poorly at the bottom. So I took out the middle group, and I just studied the ones at the very top compared with the ones at the very bottom, and tried to come up with some factor that went with that. And I wasn't getting anywhere till I started asking them questions about failure. Now, I define failure as when you set a goal and you don't achieve it. Have you ever done that? Have you ever set a goal and you haven't achieved it? In any field of your life. Could be something major like trying for a job and not getting it, or it could be something minor, like you have a game of golf with your best friend every weekend and some days you win and some days you lose. Minor or major, it doesn't seem to matter. The question is, what do you do next? What do you do after you have a failure? Because what I discovered was that was the critical thing, and that clearly separated these two groups. In fact, what I discovered was that all of the top academic students, that is every single one, had learned how to fail well. I coined that term. And every single one of these students at the bottom level was failing badly. So what does that mean? Well, it's very simple. In that failure situation where a child sets their own goal, it has to be their goal, when they set a goal and they don't achieve it, those that fail well will acknowledge their failure. They'll be prepared to say, yes, I failed. And they don't have a big emotional reaction around that. They accept that failure is part of success. And then they will take responsibility for their own actions. They will say, yes, I was responsible for that failure. It was me. And then they'll work out what they did wrong. Then they'll make changes. Then they'll go back and do it again. They'll do the same thing again, but they'll do it differently the second time round. and that's failing well. Now, one of the interesting things in my study was I discovered there was only one way to fail well, but there were lots and lots of ways to fail badly. So in the same situation, keep in mind that these were all the top academic students. The ones at the bottom were doing things like blaming the school or the system, saying it's not my fault, it's the school's fault. Obviously it's the school's fault, it's not my fault. Or they might blame other people. It's not my fault, it's the teacher's fault. Obviously the teacher didn't teach me the wrong thing, it's not the right thing, it's not my fault. Or they might pretend they never get or do anything wrong. These were students who were doing really badly who were saying, no, just ignore it, it'll go away, it's fine. There were other students who would add a whole lot of drama to their failure. You know, my life is over, I can't go to school, it's all bad. A whole lot of drama to make it too big to deal with. Or there were students who would avoid any activity that could possibly result in failure. This was a group of students who would never ever try anything new that they didn't already feel competent at. They would only do things that they already felt they were good at. And if a teacher ever made them do something that they didn't feel good at, as soon as possible they would drop it and go back to what they were already good at. Never challenge the possibility of failure. So this is an interesting thing, I thought. And since 2009, I've been teaching this model to students all around the world. And it's very, very simple. To take the simplest example, all you've got to do is this. If you imagine that your child sits a test at school, any test at all, any subject, and imagine there are 10 questions in the test. And imagine they decide before the test that they really want to do really well. Their goal is to get maybe 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 right. They want to be right up the top. And let's just imagine it doesn't happen. Maybe they only get 7 out of 10 right. So they haven't achieved their goal. By my definition, they failed. So someone who fails well will look at the 7 out of 10 they got right and think, well, at least I passed. But then they'll go back and look at the 3 out of 10 they got wrong. And they'll work out why they got them wrong. But then they'll redo those questions. Not enough just to know why you got them wrong. You actually have to reprocess those questions until you've got them right. And they'll check with the teacher or the textbook to make sure they've got them right. And they might even do 1 or 2 more problems like those 3 so that they're absolutely sure if they see problems like that again, they'll be able to do them. And then they'll put the whole thing behind them and move on. They've learned from that. They can move on. That's failing well. Someone who fails badly in the same situation will look at the 7 out of 10 they got right and think, excellent, I passed. And then they'll put the whole thing behind them. And they'll never ever look at the questions they got wrong. That's the distinction. It's a very simple thing. It just involved reprocessing any time your children don't achieve their goals. Going back, make changes, and do it again. Does this make sense? Okay. It looks like you probably need a little bit of a break. I will take a short break to stretch. I want to show you a couple of resources you might be interested in. I have 2 books that I've written in this area, this whole area of resilience and helping children to succeed. This is a book called Exam Confidence, which is a book of examination skills. And this is the book of the stuff I've just been talking about. This is a book for parents called The Importance of Failing Well. So these are 2 books that are available on my website if you're interested. So we're going to go for I've got about another 25 minutes to go, so I think it'd be a good idea if you stand up and have a little bit of a stretch now. If anyone's interested in these books, I do have a few copies here I can let you have on my website. So this is the parents' book, this is the students' book. From here, this is probably about $35 Singaporean, this is probably about $25 Singaporean, I think, thereabouts. Plus postage and handling. I think together there must be about $75 to get the 2 on my website. But tonight, if you're interested, you can have the 2 together for $50 Singaporean, if anyone is interested. Just take a short break, stand up, have a bit of a stretch, come and see me if you're interested in any of these books. I've only got a few of them here, but you're welcome to have them at that price if you wish. Okay? Stand up, have a stretch. Introduce yourself to someone you don't know. Say hello to someone. Take a stretch. Thank you very much for that. I'll also be here at the end of this talk. You're welcome to come up and ask any questions, and I'll help you with any problems that you can see. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce you to my family. I talked a little about them at the beginning, but I'll just go into a little bit more detail because I think they're useful lessons. So as I said, the best student in my household was my daughter, 3 sons, 1 daughter. And she got the highest qualifications you can get in a New Zealand secondary school. She did brilliantly. She went straight to university and got her bachelor's degree, went straight on, got a master's degree, and went straight into a job. An absolute straight line path that was very predictable. It met our expectations, met her expectations. It was great. And here is her graduation photograph. That's my daughter on the right. And this is one of her graduation photographs. Okay, so that was a very predictable, sensible, straight line path. Seemed to be the right thing. And my second son was very similar. He didn't do as well as his sister, but he did quite well at school. He got the necessary qualifications, went straight to university, got a degree in electronic commerce, went straight into a job of internet banking, and has done very well, very successful in that area too. Another straight line path. Everything worked the way I would have predicted it. But then came my oldest boy. My oldest boy, he got as far as year 13, what you would call year 6. And you have a similar year to New Zealand, like February to November. So this was about March in his final year, and he came to my wife and I and said, I want to drop out. He said, what? You know, he's only got 8 months to go. Surely you can hang in for another 8 months, and then you'll have your qualification. No, I want to drop out. So he said, well, what do you want to do? He said, I want to go to Italy. Why Italy? He couldn't really tell us, but he was absolutely determined to go to Italy. So in our family, we certainly have an ethic of allowing children to make decisions if we think they're old enough to take responsibility for those decisions, even if we think the decisions are not smart decisions. So we said to them, okay, if you're totally committed to this, we won't say no. Are you prepared to work hard to achieve that goal? So he said yes. So he took 2 part-time jobs, stayed at school, took 2 part-time jobs. He earned half the money that it took to go to Italy. We provided the other half. We got him on one of those AFS exchange students. So some students came to New Zealand, some of our students went to Italy. So he worked really hard. It's interesting in AFS because you get to choose 3 countries. He wrote down Italy, Italy, Italy. I still don't know why. But anyway, so he went off to Italy on this exchange program, got dropped into a school near Milan, spoke no Italian, by the way, no Italian, not a word. And so the only subject he was any good at was English. But he stayed and it was very, very lucky. He landed in a wonderful Italian household, wonderful family. They looked after him like he was their own son. And it worked out so well, we invited their son to come and live with us. And it all worked out very well. But we didn't know that at the time. So he stayed with this wonderful family. And about 6 or 7 months after he arrived, he actually managed to master Italian. Obviously, that was his actual goal. He didn't bother to tell anyone, but that was his goal. And he mastered Italian, the Italian language. And so by the time he came home, 11 months later, after he'd left, he was fluent in Italian. So he arrives back in New Zealand. He's got no school qualifications, and he's fluent in Italian, which is not a terribly marketable skill in New Zealand, I have to say. So he couldn't get a job. No one wanted to hire him. He didn't have any school qualifications, so he had to start taking some really menial jobs. So he was knocking on people's doors, trying to sell them things they didn't want at prices they couldn't afford on commission only. He was making pizzas. He was delivering hamburgers. He was doing all sorts of rough jobs. And he did those jobs for 2 years because he's very stubborn. He did those jobs for 2 years until finally he decided he didn't want to be a pizza delivery boy for the rest of his life. So he went back to school. He finished off that final year. He went to university, got a degree and a management degree, and he went out. Now he works for Fonterra, one of our biggest companies, and is doing very well. But you notice his path wasn't straight at all. It was very crooked. It was like this. But it was still absolutely the best path for him. But it required a lot of courage on my wife and myself's part to say, okay, we won't stop you. We think this is not a smart decision, but we think you will learn from this, and that will be a good thing to do. And I think it was very much the best path, because if we had forced him to stay at school, we still had that legal right to force him to stay at school. All that would have happened would have been a whole lot of resentment, a whole lot of anger, and he probably would have ended up doing something he didn't want to do. Whereas we accepted that he could make his own decisions, and it worked out well. So here are my two oldest boys. This is the one who went straight through, and this is the one who went off to Italy and came back. As it happens, because the difference in their ages, they both ended up at university at the same time and graduated at the same time. So under this heading, education is not a race, the point I'm trying to make is that it's not first to finish who wins. It's not a race. It's not a straight line path for every child. Sometimes it's a very divergent path. So keeping in mind this theme, I had to also show my children that really, really old people can also get qualifications. So I went back to university and got my master's degree just a few years ago to show them that elderly people can still think. And then there was my youngest son. My youngest son had never enjoyed school. He hated school. He never had a good time. He never succeeded. He never achieved anything. He did the bare minimum, and he never ever enjoyed himself at all the way through school. So he gets to what we call year 12, you call year 5. He gets to the beginning of year 5. He's at school, and he comes home to my wife and I and says, I want to drop out. Now, he's still got 2 years to go. And he's only 16 years old. But we had this big discussion about why do you want to drop out? And because he wasn't enjoying it. So what do you want to do instead? He said, I want to become a carpenter. So I thought, okay, well, it's a reasonable occupation. So he dropped out of school to take up an apprenticeship. His decision. But then the recession hit in New Zealand and no builders were taking on apprentices, so he got it half completed and then he was out of work and he couldn't complete his apprenticeship. So now he's got no school qualifications and no trade qualifications either. So he once again, like his older brother, had to do lots and lots of menial jobs, builders labouring type jobs. And he did those for nearly 3 years until he finally came to the decision that education was worth having. Now, he had to get himself back to school and do a huge amount of work to catch up his schooling. He had to study with students who were much younger than him. It was really, really hard. He then had to do an entrance examination to be allowed to go to university. He then had to do another exam to learn how to study at university, and then he got to university, and he graduated at the end of last year with a major in geography and psychology. But the most interesting thing was he got A and B passes all the way through his university. He had never achieved anything above a C pass all the way through schooling. But when he was motivated, when it was his decision, he did brilliantly at university. So same lesson that we learned, that when children make a decision, if you consider them old enough to make that decision and take the responsibility, at some stage you've got to let them make those decisions, even if you don't think they're smart decisions. And here is my youngest son. That's him on the left there. And I don't know if you know who this guy here is. That's our Prime Minister, John Key. So obviously my son has very powerful friends these days. But the point being that education is not always a straight line path. Sometimes it's very crooked. And I guess the most important point for me is that a parent's ambition and a child's ambition might be completely different. But if you want your child to have a fulfilling life, you want your child to have a life where they actually apply themselves passionately to what they do, to put in the maximum effort and to do really well in life, they've got to do something that was a part of their decision making, not a parent's decision making. The worst thing, I think, is when a parent decides what a child's ambition will be and puts every pressure they can on to get that child to do what they want. I think it's important that children learn how to make their own decisions and take responsibility for those decisions, even if some of those decisions are not smart decisions. But it's up to parents to judge at what age are they capable of handling the consequences of their own decision making. So that's my lesson under education is not a race. The reason I'm so focused on this whole failing well and resilience, and I think that's a characteristic certainly of my children, is that they're very resilient. They handle difficulties really well, is simply because of at-risk children. You know, once upon a time, at-risk children were disadvantaged children. They were very easy to recognize. These days, it's not the case. This is a quote from the United States by a professor at Columbia University. She said that America's newly identified at-risk group is preteens and teens from affluent, well-educated families. In spite of their economic and social advantages, they experienced amongst the highest rates of depression, substance abuse, somatic complaints, and unhappiness of any group of children in the country. Now, I don't know if it's the same here, but I do see it in lots of parts of Asia where affluent families, children of affluent families, are actually suffering the most traumatic problems. And if you think that resonates with you a little bit, there's a wonderful book called The Price of Privilege by Dr. Madeline Levine, American psychiatrist. And she thinks that all this stuff, all the difficulties that affluent children face, are the two main contributing factors are achievement pressure and isolation from parents. Parents who are over-involved in the wrong things and under-involved in the right things. And what she's talking about is your modern family, where everyone's busy, no one has any time. The only intersection between busy, successful parents and children is around achievement. So in these kind of families, the only time there's a conversation between parents and children, it's all about what scores did you get, what grades do you get, what can you do, can we get some extra tuition, can we get some extra help, you've got to achieve. It's all about achievement pressure. And there's no time for anything else. You know, one thing I've learned in 21 years of doing what I do and 30 years of being in education and as a parent is that the most important thing you can ever spend on your children is your time. Have you ever heard of this concept of quality time? I think it's complete nonsense. I think there is no such thing as quality time. There is either time or no time. It's as simple as that. You know, I've been doing what I do, as I said, for 21 years I've been traveling around New Zealand and then around the world for the last 16 years. So I've been away from home a huge amount. And so I haven't seen my own children growing up. I've missed out on enormous amounts of my own children's growing up. Now, they haven't missed out too much because my wife has been there to take care of what needs to be taken care of. I'm the one that's missed out. And you don't get that back. So now my children are all grown up. I have a good relationship with all of them. It's all fine. I see them quite a lot. But I missed out huge amounts of their growing up because I didn't put that time in. Now, that's an important thing. And it doesn't have to be time doing anything. It doesn't have to be quality time. It can just be hanging out time. It can just be doing nothing time. It can just be chilling out and playing Xbox together, whatever. Doesn't matter what it is. Time with your children is the most important thing. And not wrapped around achievement. Just wrapped around hanging out. That's important. Well, I think it is. So how do we grow resilient children? I think you've got to encourage them to take on new challenges and use failure as feedback. Encourage them to push their boundaries. Encourage them to do things they're not comfortable with. That's a good thing because they'll learn that of course you fail, of course you fall over. That's not a bad thing. You go back and you do it again. That's what we use sport for. That's what we use all sorts of things for. Encourage them to push their own boundaries. Don't keep them safe and allow them to stretch their own boundaries. Also help them to notice the way they recover from adversity. You know, when children have difficulties, you know, when they're little, they fall over, they skin their knees, they're crying. And after a while, they forget about that, they get up and run away. It's really good to get them to notice that. Did you notice how quickly you got back to feeling good again? That's a really important skill. So when they get older and they have a fight with their boyfriend or their girlfriend and it's all terrible and it's all drama and it's terrible and they're feeling miserable, but a few days later, they're feeling happy again. It's really good to notice that and say to them, it's wonderful that you know how to get yourself back to feeling happy again. That's a very important factor. You know, that's resilience. That's real strength. You know, I've heard some stories just recently about this part of the world, which are, some of these things are very worrying because when I started this work 21 years ago in New Zealand, we had the highest rate of teenage suicide in the world. In New Zealand. We still have the third or fourth highest, but we used to have the very highest rate of teenage suicide. And I'm sorry if this is painful for anyone here, but it is a fact. And certainly in this part of the world, it is an issue. It is a serious issue. Now, suicide comes about through two factors, I think. A combination of helplessness and hopelessness. Now, the hopelessness, I mean, you look around the world today, all the disasters in the world, it's no wonder that children sometimes feel there is no hope. But helplessness is something that can be overcome. Children only feel helpless if they think there's nothing I can do. It's all going bad and there's nothing I can do. But if your child has grown up hearing all the time that it's wonderful that you know how to get yourself back to feeling happy again, it's wonderful that you know how to recover from adversity, how to overcome difficulties. If they've heard that all their life, then if there is ever a time then they're feeling really down, they're feeling helpless and hopeless, maybe they'll say to themselves, well, actually, I know that I always get back to feeling happy again because my mum has always reminded me about that. You know, that simple message gives them the feeling that they can take some action to get back to feeling okay again. So I think it's very important to focus on helping them notice how they get back to feeling happy. And it's just pointing at it and noticing it and naming it. Next, what about learning? How do we develop resilient learners? I think if children have problems understanding or learning schoolwork, you've got to focus them on the things they can control. And there's only two things they can control: how much effort they put in and how they apply that effort, what strategies they use. In other words, strategies for time management, strategies for learning, strategies for self-motivation, those kind of things. Now, the only place really these days to go for good strategies, or the best place, is the internet. But I want to start by looking at this thing about effort. I don't know if you're aware of this woman here, Professor Carol S. Dweck. She's a professor at Stanford University. She's done a whole lot of work on mindset things. But she did a long time ago, she did some really interesting work around praise. Now, just imagine for a minute that your child does something great, something wonderful, has a really good mark, a really good performance, a really good grade, something really good. And you want to say to them, well done, that's great. What do you focus your praise on? Because it actually seems to make a difference. Because what happens is, if you focus your praise on effort, it's wonderful to see how hardworking you are, how diligent you are, how persevering you are. What you're doing is you're connecting your approval to something the child has some control over. They can always do more of it. So then, any test or assessment is just a measure of progress and an opportunity to learn. So they're not afraid of trying new things because you've connected praise to something they have control over. But if you praise that child for ability, you're so smart, talented, intelligent, what you're doing is you're connecting your approval to something the child has no control over. They can't do more of it. Ability is that idea of something fixed. They can't do more of it. So then any assessment is a critical judgment and an opportunity to fail. So the trick is to connect your praise to some factor the child has some control over. Then they can always generate more success and they can deal well with failure. But I don't mean you go home tonight and you open up your child's door and you say, it's wonderful to see how hardworking you are, and you got that one done. It's not that easy. You've actually got to catch them putting in effort. And it doesn't matter where the effort is. A child who's not putting in effort at school, but who's putting in a huge amount of effort on the soccer field, learning how to play football and putting in an enormous amount of time, you can still use that as an example. You can say, have you noticed how many hours you put into your football and the results that you achieve? Imagine if you put that much time into your algebra, what you could do. It's the same strategy in a different context. So what I think we've got to do is we've got to focus any praise for achievement on observed effort rather than ability. Not that there's anything wrong with ability. Ability is wonderful. But ability by itself is kind of sterile. Ability plus effort can produce magic. Also, we've got to help them focus on the processes of learning, the learning strategies they're using as the best source of improvement. And as I mentioned a second ago, these days, it's all about using good internet resources. Now, there are over 200 good school subject websites these days that children can use if they're not understanding something at school. They can go somewhere else, get the same information at the right level in a different way, maybe in a video or a podcast or a game or an activity. There are so many good websites. But all you really need is these three here to find all the rest. These three are written on that page that you've got, and let me just show you what they are. This one here is my website. I have a students page which looks like this. If you go to the students page, you'll find up here there's a whole lot of tips for self-management and tips for motivation, that kind of thing. There's some videos of how to construct an exam timetable, but there's also links to 75 different websites that students have sent to me and told me are excellent websites for study. So I've got links to 75 of them on my website. So that's one place to go. Another place to go is this website here called Top Marks. Now, it's amazing to me how many people don't know about Top Marks, because it is the best website to find school subject-based material. It's actually a search engine for school subject websites, and it's British. If your children are doing the IGCSE, that's a British qualification. This is the best website. It looks like this. They go in here, they select a subject. All the subjects are listed there. So they click on a subject, then they click on the age group. If it's British, so if they're doing IGCSE, they will be Key Stage 4. Remember that, Key Stage 4 for IGCSE. If they're doing the diploma, it's called Advanced Level. If you're not familiar with this, just ask someone from England. So they select their subject, they select the age group, they click over here, and at the bottom it brings up links to all the websites these people have found that cover that subject at that level. It's a brilliant site. You can also search by topic. They can put their topic they're studying up here, click over here, it will bring up all the websites that cover that subject at that level. So that's the second one, Top Marks. And the last one is Just for English Literature. I don't know if your children study English literature. Most children seem to. Okay. Well, there's a site called Free Book Notes that English teachers hate it because it gives it all away. Because what they do is they go to this site here, they put in the book that they're studying, the play they're studying, the poem they're studying, the film they're studying. They click over here and it brings up all the websites that do all the analysis for them. It's a great site. But of course, you don't want to encourage your children to plagiarize. There's nothing good about plagiarizing, cutting and pasting. But these days, learning is about finding 3 different websites that contain the material you want, cutting and pasting into a doc, and then rewriting the whole thing, rewriting it all in your own words. That's how you create understanding. You create understanding by finding good resources and rewriting it in your own words. And that works. So this is a great site for that. And here's more and more. There are so many good websites these days, but like I said, you actually only need those top 3 to get, I know everyone likes to photograph them, but you only need the top 3 to get all these, okay? But yes, most of these websites are less than 5 years old as well. It's all very, very new, but the future of learning is learning through the internet, absolutely. But we still need teachers. We need teachers to explain things, to make sense of things, to create pathways for students, to help them to achieve their goals. But in the future, we're not going to need teachers so much to push information at children. Children are going to find it for themselves. Teachers are going to help them process it. Okay. So I'm nearly finished. Organisation. So obviously high-speed internet is necessary. You can't do without it. If you're concerned about the children getting into stuff you don't want them to get into, there's 2 interesting apps you might like to look into. This one's fascinating, our Pact. A friend of mine who's a principal gave me this one. All the children in the room need to put their fingers in their ears, because this is a website that if a parent has this website, they can link it to a child's computer, and at the push of a button, they can stop all the apps on a child's computer working. All the apps. Just like that. What's happening? Oh, study time now. So yes, it's a control system. There's also one called Self-Control, which is very weird. I think it's weird because it's an app that children set up that's called Self-Control. And what they do is they program it to turn off all their apps at a certain time and turn them back on later. So they set up their study for the night, 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and the Self-Control app turns everything off that they don't want to be, all their games, and turns them back on later. So it does it for them. But why don't they just do that themselves? I never quite understand this. But the thing about self-control is once you've set up all your apps to be turned off, you can't go back and reset it until the time has expired. So anyway, so there's funny things you can do. Another thing, make sure children have a place to do schoolwork that suits them physically. They're growing all the time. The chair should grow, the desk should grow, the light should be good. There should be a place to stick work up in front of them, a place that's theirs, a good place, that's comfortable for them, that works for them. Physical factors are very important. Help them build good habits of study, if possible at the same time every day. It doesn't suit every person. You don't want to force this kind of thing, but if a child can develop a habit, from this time to this time, every night I get my work done, that's a really good thing to build because habits don't need any more reinforcement. They go by themselves because they're habits. So those are good things. Help them learn to use the things they enjoy as rewards for getting work done. There's nothing wrong with Facebook. There's nothing wrong with Instagram. There's nothing wrong with Snapchat. There's nothing wrong with all those social media sites, but they should happen after a child gets their work done, not before. So those are good things, but to be done after the work's done. Then they've got something to look forward to. It's a reward. It's a payback for getting their work done. Critically important, to remember what they learn at school. Each night, children need to read over what they did that day. Every night, they need to take out all the stuff they did that day and just skim through it again to remake the connections in the brain that they made during the day. That second review, that they saw it once in class, they look at it again that night, that starts building long-term memory. That's important. This is very critical. There's a lot of study done by a man named Professor John Hattie from New Zealand, now in Australia, and he's made a study of over 2 million students, and he found the single thing that improved student performance most was forming study groups. And by a study group, I mean 2 or 3 or 4 children who get together on a regular basis and teach each other. So it's quite good if one person's good at one subject, another person has a strength in another subject. They teach each other. It's been found to improve performance better than anything else. Anything else. And the interesting thing is children get better at the subject they're being taught by their friends because their friends can put it in language they understand, but they also get better at the one they're teaching their friends because when you teach something, you have to understand it really well in order to teach it. So they get better at both subjects. Study groups are awesome. Anything you can do to support a study group, invite them round, put on a cup of tea and whatever, anything you can do to support a study group is will pay off really, really well. But of course, they've got to use the time together to get work done, obvious. Okay, so this is the last thing. Parent as role model. Of course, your children are imitating people all the time. They're trying to work out who to be like. And the person they're going to imitate most is you. So the trick is always to make the culture of your family a learning culture. Now, what I mean by this is that is learning a high priority in your family? You know, in a family that has established a learning culture, let's say Johnny's reading the newspaper and he comes across a word he doesn't understand and he says, "Mum, what does autotelic mean?" If the family's a learning culture, Mum might say, "I've no idea, but let's get the dictionary and look it up." Or let's go online and look it up. She'll be interested to find out what it is because she doesn't know. That's a learning culture. In a family that doesn't have a learning culture, if Johnny says, "What does autotelic mean, Mum?" Mum might say, "You don't need to know that." That's a non-learning culture, right? Simple, isn't it? So who knows what autotelic means? Aha! See, that's your homework for tonight, you see. No, I'll give you this one, because it's a very fascinating word. The word autotelic means worth doing for its own sake. And that's what education needs to be. Education is not for grades and awards and scores and even for qualifications. Education is something that's worth doing for its own sake, to become educated. So, the trick, of course, once you realize your children are going to imitate you, is to strive always to be worthy of imitation. That's the hard one, isn't it? Okay, so just to finish off, to get to where you are today, how many of you had to work hard? Anyone ever have to work hard? You don't need to put your hands up. Anyone have to suffer physically, mentally, emotionally? Anyone have to forego any pleasures in their life? Is this what life's about? Anyone have suffered personal or business setbacks? And how many of you want to give your children the benefits of your struggles without them having to go through the distress? This is the modern parenting thing, isn't it? I had to work really hard all my life to achieve what you've got, but now I want to give it to you so you don't have to struggle. Unfortunately, it doesn't work very well. Because how many of you think that the difficulties you've faced, the problems you have overcome, the suffering you have endured, have helped you to develop the resilience you need to create the success for yourself and your family that you enjoy today? It's only by struggle, it's only by overcoming difficulties that we actually create resilience. So the secret with children is simple. All we've got to do is make them suffer, right? It's simple, isn't it? No, what I mean is, so why protect your children from responsibility and the possibility of failure? You're not doing your children any favors by protecting them from those two things. So it seems to me all our children need to earn what they get, not have it given to them. They need to organize their own lives. They need to take responsibility for their own actions. They need to fight their own battles, make their own decisions and take all the consequences, succeed, and on the way to succeeding, fail well. So that's pretty much it from me. This is I've got one quote, that's right, to show you that this is not a new problem. This is a quote from many, many years ago, 1780. Too many parents make life hard for their children by trying too zealously to make it easy for them. An interesting thing, isn't it? It's not a new problem. So this is my website. There's tips for parents, there's tips for students, there's all sorts of stuff there you're welcome to have a look at. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, and good night. Feel free to come up and see me and ask any questions after we're finished.
Test. From everyone here, we'd just like to say a big thank you to Mr. Lance King for coming down and talking to us today. We hope that you all enjoyed the talk, and as Mr. King said, if you'd like to ask him any questions or maybe purchase a copy of the book, you can do so now. Thank you and good evening.